Welcome to Making Sense of Modernity. This is your fourth lecture in the series, and today we're going to look at issues of technology and how developing modern technologies have impacted on such phenomena as literacy, but also as instigators of social change and are used as a tool for increasing social organisation, which is also a theme we'll come back to in a couple of the future lectures, so this is more of an introductory thing. But also, whilst some people use it to instigate change, other people are very resistant to change, and particularly resistant to the technologies they see as embodying or imposing change that they don't want. So we'll look at the other side of the coin as well. Now, in your own mind, as I rabbit away, if you have a think about the items of modern technology, things invented within the last 100 years that you have in your house or flat or wherever you live, that might be things that you use on a daily basis, like perhaps a mobile phone or a computer. It can also be things that you use less often, say a washing machine or a tumble dryer. It might be electric lawnmowers that you rake out once every couple of few weeks or once a month or less often than that. You might also have things in your house that you hardly ever use. Maybe Christmas presents that some relative gave to you that you put in the back of a cupboard and it's been sitting there for about 5 years now, covered in dust and hardly ever put to any sort of use whatsoever. The chances are you're going to have quite a lot of technology in your house that does a great many things, unless you've made a very conscious effort to minimize the presence of technology in your life. And when we talk about technology, that can include all manner of devices, but these days frequently the word is used in connection with computers and increasingly with artificial intelligence as a very specific type of computer technology. So very frequently these days we tend to use the term to mean electronic technology specifically, rather than say clockwork technology or technology in the way archaeologists use that term when they're talking about pots and baskets and swords and shields, all of which are as such technological devices, even if they are not the kinds of things we tend to think of and categorize as being technology these days. Now, if your mind's been chugging over the last minute or two while I've been waffling away about the various devices in your house, you might have thought of all sorts of things, and I will bet that most other students in the class have a lot of the same stuff as each other. And some of it they will use very, very frequently, and some of it much more sporadically, but it is amazing how much stuff we accumulate. And then to think about, and this is something we can do as we go along rather than in this exact moment, the impact that this technology has on our lives. So one example, which we did mention in class a few weeks ago, was that there are lots of devices which are marketed to us as being labour saving. So rather than taking the washing down to the river and doing the laundry on a rock, we now have washing machines to chuck our laundry into and press a couple of buttons and off it chunders and it does everything that we want it to do. In saving us labour, saving also the time and the effort and the energy of traipsing down to a river, what do we do with the time saved? So one impact is to reduce the amount of effort we have to make in our life. So we no longer are scrubbing bed sheets on the rock by the river, but what are we doing instead? So the impact of technology is not only in what it enables us to perhaps avoid doing ourselves because the machine does it for us, but what possibilities it opens up for us to do instead. If we're not doing A, what are we doing? Are we doing B, C, D or E, or maybe we're not doing much of anything? But what other possibilities does it open for us? Now, I've already mentioned that technology can include things like swords and shields and baskets and ancient forms of technology that we don't tend to use as much these days. Well, certainly not the swords and the shields, we still use baskets. But it's things that are created, made, manufactured, produced goods. Whether we're making it for our own use, or we're making it to give as a gift to somebody, or we're making to sell to somebody else. We hope that these people buy stuff and then we can use the money to buy whatever it is that we need in exchange. In some parts of the world it's more barter than sale for cash, but the end result is pretty much the same, that we create something that somebody else will want, and in exchange we get something that we want somewhere along the line, as a result of making the first article. It's worth bearing in mind as we get more into Michel Foucault later this year, and then more so into the second year, that he uses the word technology in a slightly different context. So whereas historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and a lot of sociologists use the word technology to mean objects that are made for a use, Foucault uses the term technology to indicate social systems as well. So the criminal justice system, the church, the educational system are all what he terms as technology. They're means of bringing people together to engage in particular tasks, particular functions, and to grease the wheels of society to enable certain processes to happen. For the majority of this lecture, we're going to focus on the earlier idea of technology as manufactured objects, rather than use the term in the way that Foucault means it. We'll leave the rest of his theories to a later occasion. You could argue that technology has existed since the very first day when some long distant ancestor, back when we were all living in caves, picked up a rock and used it to make a spearhead, or used it to bash some creature over the skull with, and then cook them for dinner, or even eat them raw, as the case may be. That sort of very simplistic level of tool use is the very first beginning of human technology. And of course humans aren't the only creatures on the planet to use tools. Apes use them, birds use them, all sorts of creatures use objects that they find, and sometimes objects that they make, for an expressed purpose. But mostly what we're looking at here are objects that involve a manufacturing process. So picking up a rock, using it as a weapon and putting it back down again, the rock hasn't changed much. Whereas cutting a bunch of twigs off a tree and then weaving them into a basket involves a process of change. We might have soaked those trees in water, twigs rather, in water to make them more pliable. We might have painted them different colours to make it prettier to look at the basket. All sorts of things might have gone on. There is a process of changing the raw material in some way in order to make the object, the tool, the article that we want to use. So most of the time when we're talking about technology, we're indicating something where there has been a manufacturing process, rather than just picking up a rock or picking up a club, a wooden stick, and using it without necessarily changing the thing much at all. And obviously as we get into modern times, then electricity becomes a much more key feature, mass production becomes a much more key feature. We go from the individual carpenter of 500 years ago labouring for hours on end to make a chair, to factories churning out 100 chairs a minute, and it being mainly done by either mass production lines or indeed these days more likely by robots churning out articles in vast numbers. It's all forms of technology, and there are of course different impacts between the skilled craftsman or craftswoman making an individual object entirely and the person on a production line who is just engaging in one small part of the manufacturing process, to the fully automated manufacturing process carried out by machines entirely with hardly any human involvement whatsoever. It has a big impact on society and economics and all sorts of areas like that. But we'll start by thinking about the technology of literacy. What do we mean by this? Well, the printing press, as you can see in that picture there, where there's the man heaving away at the printing press to produce pages of what looks like a newspaper. It could possibly be a very big book, but it's anyway, whatever it is, they are producing pages to be read. Now, the printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg back in 1450. There were obviously people in the world who could read before the invention of the printing press, but prior to that, every book they read had to be written by hand. So if somebody wanted a copy of the Bible, it required at least one other person, much more usually a whole bunch of other people, mostly monks, to sit in scriptorium, well-lit rooms in monasteries, with lots and lots of blank paper and coloured inks and quills and so forth, and they had to copy out pages of the Bible by hand. And usually there'd be a small army of monks, each copying out a different page, and then all of those pages would be put together in the correct order and bound, and then be ready to sell to someone. It would cost an absolute fortune, because it involved so many people and all those expensive inks and all of the time, enormous amounts of time, because they were very artistically illustrated works, and then the vellum, the animal skin that was used as pages, and the book bindings. Books were phenomenally expensive things to have prior to the invention of the printing press. Even if we're going back to the days of, say, ancient Egypt, when things were written on papyrus scrolls, it still took an awful long time to copy out a replica of an existing scroll so that somebody else could have their own copy of a particular publication. And it was still a very expensive process, nowhere near as expensive as, say, a medieval Bible, but nonetheless a costly thing. And so it was only the very well-to-do who could afford to buy books, and usually only the very well-to-do who were educated enough to even read them in the first place. One of the impacts of inventing the printing press was they could, in effect, do away with all those monks in scriptoria, scribbling away with their quills on parchments, copying out pages of Bibles and various other types of book, and have specialists who would assemble from little metal letters pages and pages of books and churn them out dozens a minute, and those books would then be assembled by bookbinders. Still a relatively slow process, because that was done mainly by hand, compared to the robots that churn out books in publishing factories by the crate-load these days. Much speedier process. So back in Gutenberg's lifetime it was a slower process. But the cost of the book at the end, or the newspaper, or the pamphlet, or whatever it was that they were churning out, was a fraction of what it would have been in earlier centuries. Much, much cheaper price. And so it was no longer just the very rich who could afford these things. It then became available to the middle classes. And as they could afford to buy them, more and more people wanted to be educated enough to actually read them. It's not just to have them as objects on shelves gathering dust, but to actually be able to read these things. So the supply of books led to a demand for the teaching of reading and writing to larger and larger numbers of people. And as the technology improved with the passage of time and was able to churn out more and more books and pamphlets and so on for cheaper and cheaper prices, that gradually filtered its way down to the working classes, or back in the period of history we're looking at, around the 1400s and into the 1500s, down to the peasants, who also started to want to be able to read. They couldn't afford books necessarily, but they could afford pamphlets. They could afford, in due course, when they started to be published, they could afford newspapers. And if they could afford them, they wanted to be able to read them. And so literacy spread from being the privilege of the very well-off down and down and down society, until more and more people could read. It also challenged notions of not simply the social class of who could read, but also issues such as gender. That it was more common, depending on which country we're looking at, more common for men to be taught to read than for women to be taught to read. But as books, as newspapers, as pamphlets and so forth became available, more and more women wanted to be able to read them too. And so middle-class families were often as keen to have their daughters learn to read as to have their sons learn to read. Partly so they could read the Bible and other sacred books, as well as reading more commonplace things. But also, in time, the realization that people who could read could carry out a much wider range of jobs, and those jobs tended to be better paid than manual labour. And so women could help in the family businesses. They could help keep records. They could help monitor incomings and outgoings, which required a knowledge of mathematics as well as reading and writing. And so it began to change the very notion of who could do what, who was allowed to do what. Even down to the Victorian era, there were concerns around people with more specific jobs, whether or not they should read. So should servants be able to read the same newspapers, the same books, as their employers were able to read, as the local lords and ladies of the manor were able to read? Or would certain books put untoward ideas in their minds? Even as we get into the 20th century, this was still an ongoing concern. So when D.H. Lawrence published Lady Chatterley's Lover, which at the time was considered very racy, practically pornography. If you read it these days, it actually seems quite tame, but by the standards of the day, it was considered terribly racy. There were court cases in which one judge quite openly said, "Do you want your servants reading this kind of material? Will it put ideas into their impressionable minds?" And therein is an interesting conception that literacy opens all sorts of people up to the discovery of ideas that they would not previously necessarily have known about. And some of those ideas might be very uplifting and ennobling, but also the concern in society that some of those ideas might be very improper, very untoward. And so are some people too young to be aware of certain ideas? Are there certain concepts that should only be encountered by an adult mind rather than by a child's mind? Are there some individuals who may be so lacking self-control that they could be inflamed to inappropriate or criminal behaviour by the sorts of ideas they're exposed to? Not just in the sense of racy, slightly naughty sexual material, but political ideas. So we have discussions ongoing now around radicalisation and people reading websites or listening to podcasts, putting out political ideas that will somehow unhinge them and lead them to engage in terrorist acts. Is this a valid idea, or is it an exaggeration of the power of information? It's, as Aristotle said, it's perfectly possible to entertain an idea without being converted to it. You can think about a thing without agreeing with it. But there is this concern that even thinking about certain things makes some people much more likely to agree with them than if they'd never thought about them in the first place. Other big impacts included the Reformation of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther, who had been a monk and was very disgusted by the levels of greed and corruption and untoward behaviour that he saw amongst bishops and archbishops and so on, and fellow monks within the Catholic Church, he wanted to change and reform the Church, make it into a much more morally upstanding place. So he published his theses, his statements of what he wanted to see happen within the Church to make it a better place, and nailed it to the door of a church for people to read. Because, of course, people could, by his point in history, relatively easily read what he'd written. It was no longer only the elite who could read, it was a much wider body of people by that point in time. And that led to a lot of people not only reading it, but agreeing with him that his points were correct. And that led to the publication of pamphlets and books and all manner of things. So previously, he would have had to have relied a few hundred years earlier, if he'd lived a few hundred years earlier, on preaching by word of mouth, of going from group to group to group, preaching his ideas. So he would have reached an audience, but would have been a much smaller audience. With the power of writing, he could disseminate his ideas through the printing press to a much larger number of people than he could ever have physically met. And so his ideas spread across the whole world rather than being only confined to those places he could physically travel to in order to speak to people. And that led to the rifts and schisms in the Catholic Church, which eventually led to the formation of the Protestant churches, and then later, at a later period in history, the dissident churches. So there was, or dissenting churches, sorry, not dissident. It led to a series of manifesting changes in society, all of which we can track back, arguably, to the invention of printing and the way that revolutionised the world. The very world we live in at the moment is a result, ultimately, of Gutenberg's invention. Other changes came about with mass literacy, one of which is our way of understanding and telling and passing on stories. So back in the days when very few people could read and write, if a story was to be told, it was told orally by a performer, a storyteller, sitting around the campfire or down the pub or wherever they might have been. Memory was the key. Lots of people, and they still do to today, having said, talking about hundreds of years ago, this still goes on in some parts of the world today. For example, in India and Turkey, there are individuals who can read very little, if at all, but who memorize, just by listening to it, vastly long poems, and make their living by travelling around the place and reciting these poems in different locations, and people will put money towards them as a gratitude for their performances, and they do it without being able to read the written version of those poems. They simply listen to them being told and told and told, and rehearse it and repeat it, and eventually it becomes second nature, and that becomes their form of living. But these days, of course, with the invention of the printing press and mass literacy, the vast majority of people who want to hear a story will tend to read it rather than listen to it, and it will become part of their life through reading rather than any other means. One of the impacts of this, of course, is that every time you read a story, you read a book, it's the same thing consistently. The book doesn't suddenly change. Whereas an oral story, something that's spoken to you by another living person, they're not necessarily saying it word for word the same every single time. So there is an opportunity for variation in the story. Once we have this idea of a written book, we have the idea that truth is consistent. It's the same thing every time you go back to it. And that, you could argue, is a key teaching within Christianity, as well as within Islam and Sikhism and a number of other religions that have a holy scripture, a written text, that the word of God is consistent. It's the same all of the time, because it's not reliant on the memory of one particular person. It's there, you can read it, it's a fixed thing. Once we get to the era of mass literacy, when lots of people can read the Bible or the Quran or the Upanishads or the Rig Veda or the Guru Granth Sahib or any of these other religious books, one of the impacts is that it's no longer a book to be read to you by a very learned priest. It's something you can read yourself. And so when it was something that had to be read by the only person in the entire village capable of reading, you were reliant as a community on their interpretation, their understanding, the accuracy of their knowledge. So they had exclusive control of the book. They were the only person in the village who could read it. Once lots and lots of people in a village or a town or community can read, then it challenges the exclusive control of that one person. Other people can come along and read it and say, well, actually, I don't think your understanding of this book is quite right. I think it means this. And suddenly you get disputes as to what a particular book means. If you're doing an English lit class, that's all of the time. People are disputing the meaning of a poem or the meaning of a novel. That's fine. But if it's a religious text, a holy text, that opens up possibilities of heresy, of misinterpretation, misunderstanding. Who is qualified to truly understand what a religious text means versus who's a bit daft who might misunderstand it, misinterpret it, and so be led into spiritual error. It becomes much more of a challenge to the authority and hierarchy, whether of church or synagogue or mosque or whatever other institution we're talking about, once more and more and more people are capable of reading the sacred text. This leads us to Elizabeth Eisenstein's understanding of different forms of culture. She was mainly interested in manuscript culture, the second box down on the grid there. But she also wrote about these other types of culture, and other people who have followed on from Eisenstein's research have chipped in their two pennyworth on the subject. An oral culture is one in which almost everything is reliant on the spoken word, because hardly anyone can read and write. And obviously the vast majority of conversations by their very nature that take place today are oral. By and large, we very rarely record our conversations, it's just chatting and listening. So that is still very much part of modern society, but we have the option of other forms of cultural transmission as well as the purely oral. Manuscript culture is the handwritten manuscript, those monks scribbling away in the scriptoria. It's also you writing a letter to somebody with pen and paper. That's part of manuscript culture. So an individual person sitting down with a quill or a pen or a pencil and writing down their thoughts or copying out a page of something. So it exists as a handwritten document. That enables this sense of permanency of knowledge that we were just mentioning a few minutes ago, because it's there on the page, and whether you look at that page today, tomorrow, next week, next year, next decade, the page is going to be unchanged. It's not suddenly going to rearrange the words on the page. But it also, if it's handwritten, you have to allow for the possibility of spelling mistakes, of errors, of somebody accidentally leaving out a word or accidentally adding in a word. There's room for human error, and people who live in a manuscript culture know that. Once you get to print culture, with Gutenberg and the printing press and all of the new versions of printing presses that have been developed in the centuries since Gutenberg died, you don't expect error to creep into a printed book or a printed page. Because it's not a human being sitting there scribbling it down. Yes, it involves a human being arranging the little metal letters on the printer's device, but by and large the notion of human error is massively reduced in print culture than it is in manuscript culture. And so it creates this notion that once a thing is printed, even if there's 1 million copies of that particular book in existence, that every single one of those 1 million copies will be exactly the same as each other, will say exactly the same thing, be laid out in exactly the same way. So it really hammers home this notion of consistency and the idea of fixed truth. Plus you have all the economic issues we just touched upon. Printing presses greatly reduce the cost of books and leaflets and magazines and newspapers and such like, and so more and more people become able to afford them. They also of course become disposable in the sense that today's newspaper is tomorrow's chip wrapping, so it's no longer this precious thing that you have to keep because it cost you the absolute earth to buy it. It's now cheap, and so you can throw the newspaper away. Or if a book gets a bit dog-eared, a bit manky, you can chuck it in the bin and buy a new one. Or if you've read a book and you're bored with it, you can give it to a charity shop. It's no longer precious the way it was when a book would cost you a year's wages because they were so expensive. And from there we are now into electronic culture with the invention of the internet. So you can go online, you can read 1,000,001 websites, you can download e-books and e-journals and one thing and another. Not only are books and journals part of electronic culture, but every single email, every single blog post, every single Facebook message or Twitter message or Instagram photograph, all of that is part and parcel of electronic culture. So it's now, although you can have pictures and illustrations in print works and in the handwritten manuscript, electronic culture enables a much wider array of imagery to be used alongside the writing, or even for that matter instead of the writing, including stuff by people who maybe don't have much artistic talent themselves, but they've worked out how to upload a photograph. So it vastly expands who can participate in creating written culture. So back in the days when your only option was really the print book, pre-internet, then there were authors, there were people regarded as talented, more, I mean, some authors are clearly much better than other authors, but they had a talent, they'd got published, it gave them a certain degree of kudos because there were very few published authors in the world and it was quite an achievement. It still is in many respects. But these days, anyone virtually can start posting messages on Facebook, anyone can start a blog, no matter how clever or how thick they are, they can put their ideas out there within a matter of seconds, which is also an issue. The speed at which things can be created and disseminated often means that conscious thought is perhaps circumvented, in that you might dash off an email which 10 seconds after you've sent it, you regret having written. You think, oh God, why did I say that thing? And someone's terribly offended by what you've said, or maybe you're even facing police charges depending on quite what it was that you said in that email, or you've sent it to the wrong person, or they spelt it so badly they can't work out what the hell you're on about in the first place, and you regret having created it. It's much harder to have that with a book, because by the time you've typed the thing up and sent it to an editor and they've read it and they've chopped and changed bits and it's gone back and it's gone forth and finally it's published and it's on a shelf somewhere, that can be a process of several years. And so the sense in which you might think, oh, I wish I hadn't written that, would happen at a much earlier stage. Whereas with an email or a Facebook post or whatever, it's a matter of seconds rather than a matter of years. And so that has an impact on the nature of what we write and the degree to which we understand or value or place emphasis on what other people write. Are we thinking everything we see is this worthy thing that's been laboured over and thought and rethought and researched, and a terrible amount of effort has been put into creating this book that we've acquired from the library or the bookshop? Or are we looking at an email and thinking this probably took 3 seconds to write and involves about 3 seconds worth of brain cells in it, and therefore it's worth as much as 3 seconds? It kind of shifts the value of what we are seeing. Now, there might at some point be a fifth box added to this. If someone invents some brand new contraption that moves us away from electronic communication and into whatever the next thing turns out to be, there could be a fifth, a sixth, a seventh box added as the centuries roll past and different types of communication are invented. Key thing to bear in mind here is, obviously, as we know from present day society, all of these things coexist. It's not that each time a new thing is invented, the previous one is wiped out. So we live in a world where we have electronic communication, but we can also get printed books. We can also write letters to one another or copy out things by hand if we really, really want to. And the vast majority of our communication, already said, is at the oral level. Most of what we do is spoken rather than written anyway. So all four levels of this culture exist simultaneously with one another. Social change theory deals with the idea that some forms of social change, at least, are driven by evolutionary factors and can, of course, also be driven by technological factors, which we'll get into in a second. But going back to the Victorian era of the 19th century, we have thinkers like Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer, who were very influenced by Charles Darwin and the theory of biological evolution, and this idea that bodily features develop in response to environmental change and that they're adaptations. So if the weather turns dramatically cold, a lot of creatures begin to get hairier and hairier, and that becomes a feature passed on to their offspring, because that's what helps them survive in a very cold environment. Those creatures that can't adapt freeze to death. If that's true of the realm of the body, then Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer argued it was probably true of society as well, that there are significant changes that happen in societies, and these happen as adaptations to alterations in the environment, significant weather changes, earthquakes, famines, plagues, that sort of thing. but also significant changes in more human elements, like being invaded by a foreign country or going to war with another country that may cause massive social change, or a brand new religion sweeping the world can cause massive social change. And so different societies try to adapt to these big changes. If the adaptation is successful, it persists from one generation to the next to the next. If the adaptation is useless, then either it is wiped out or possibly the entire culture is wiped out, and it simply doesn't survive. It goes under. When we do the Q&A through virtual classrooms, we can chuck around a few ideas of your own as to anything you can see in modern society that might be considered a form of social adaptation, of society having to change in response to some big alteration, either in the environment or in the more social realm of how we interact with other cultures, other countries, and changes that ripple across the world. I could suggest a few, but I think I'll leave it to you to suggest your own ideas, and then we can discuss them in class. Some people regard society as moving forward as a harmonious whole, but not everyone thinks in that way. So Karl Marx and the people who have followed him, a lot of whom are very influential in sociology, take the idea that society isn't really one big harmonious machine trundling forward. Rather, they see lots of groups within society. Now, Marx was mainly interested in defining groups of people by social class, the upper classes, the middle classes, the working classes, etc. Not everyone thinks in that way, and I'll get onto a couple of examples of that in a minute, but we'll stick with class for the moment. So you've got these different classes. And for Marx, these different classes were almost like different species. So you could look at a forest or a jungle or the ocean and say, well, the sharks eat the cod, or the tigers eat the antelopes, and there's one species that predates upon another species. And so Marx, when he looked at society, said, well, the upper classes feed off the middle classes and the working classes, and so rather than working harmoniously as one big society, there was this sense of one group of people exploiting, taking advantage, using another group of people. Later social theorists, and we'll look at some of them as we go along, but to give you a couple of examples, you've got people like Jörg Simmel, another German sociologist, and Jürgen Habermas, and various other people that we'll get to know about as the module goes on. They said it's a bit more fluid. It's not just one group of predators eating another group of prey. They said power dynamics are much more fluid, and the person who is strong today might be weak tomorrow and vice versa. And so it's not a clear-cut issue. There are also sociologists who talk about the idea of symbiosis, that one group in society can positively help another group because there's a bit of mutual back scratching going on. They effectively help each other. So then, far from preying on one another, they are positively helping one another. So not everyone has this negative view that Marx has, where it's all warfare and fighting and feuding. Other people see society in a more positive light. But nonetheless, Marx is very influential. Now, whilst Marx was going on about social class, people influenced by him have sometimes taken it in different directions. So modern day feminism, particularly third wave feminism and fourth wave feminism, are very heavily influenced by Marx. If you're unfamiliar with those terms, second and third wave, we will be getting onto an explanation of feminist doctrine quite soon and explain what those terms mean in more depth. But suffice to say for the moment that there are lots of different forms of feminism, some of which have been very prominent in one decade and others get more prominent in another decade. So these different waves have come to the fore at different points in history. Those forms of feminism which were very heavily influenced by the radical feminism of the 1970s, rather than thinking in terms of one social class exploiting and being hostile towards another, thought more in terms of warfare between the genders, between the sexes really. that exploitation was from between men and women rather than between rich and poor. And so they spoke of patriarchal society, which is a term very, very widely used these days. Not everyone likes the use of that term. Some people have suggested that patriarchy has largely died out in the West, but can still be seen in other parts of the world, whereas other people think patriarchy is very much alive and well in the West. So patriarchy literally means dominance of the fathers, the rulership of fathers, and goes back to a period of history when all of the authority positions in the world, pretty much all of them, or I say the word, in a given society, were occupied by men because women weren't allowed into positions of authority, and not just any man. It was specifically the notion that the father was the head of the household rather than his sons, his nephews, his grandchildren, etc. It was that father figure who was dominant in the household, made decisions for the house, wielded authority over the members of his family, and upwards through the levels of society, wielding authority over larger and larger numbers of people. So that notion of men being dominant and women being more put upon in a given society, disenfranchised, has maintained as an argument and a view within the various different types of feminism. And so again, rather than thinking of class warfare, they're thinking more of sex warfare between men and women. Critical race theory, which again is a Marxist conception, and wouldn't have existed if Marx hadn't started the ball rolling in the first place, takes the same basic idea of Marx, but rather than talking about social class, talks about races, and the argument that in a given society you'll have a dominant race in that society, and then you will have what's sometimes referred to as subaltern races, i.e. races with much less power, usually because there's fewer of them in a given society, that they're a racial minority. Sometimes for other reasons. South Africa is an example of a society in which, well, not these days, but back under apartheid, when it wasn't an issue of a majority group and a minority group, because the numbers were very different, but nonetheless it was an issue of a powerful group and a disenfranchised group of people. So it's critical race theory deals with this idea of conflict between races rather than conflict between social classes. But in all of these cases, it's all based upon the idea of conflict, and that conflict generates change, sometimes positive change, sometimes negative change. But it's rather than seeing society as harmoniously progressing in one direction and everyone pulling together, it sees one group exploiting, abusing, lording it over another group, and that other group having to struggle to find a sense of power and a sense of status and significance in wider society. And certainly we can discuss when we get on to the group chat which of these approaches you agree with, if any of them. Do you feel society is largely harmonious and pulling in one way, or do you see it as fractured by class or by sex or by race or some other issue? How do you envision society working? So it's something for you to think about and then come with a response during the chat. Now, the idea of technology driving change can be understood in various different ways, 4 of which are on the screen here. So imagine some man or woman sitting in their shed or their garage or at a laboratory somewhere, tinkering away and inventing some bit of technology. Could be anything that they're inventing, really. It might be that inventor has devised this bit of technology because they hope it will revolutionise society in some way. They want to see a particular change, and so they invent this contraption and try and sell it to the rest of the world because they want to change society. Or it may be that they're just tinkering away, they're experimenting, they're inventing things. They quite hope their device will be popular, but they're not expecting any great changes to come about in society. They haven't really thought about the impact their device will have in society. They're just inventing something and maybe hoping to make a bit of money selling it or whatever. They're not thinking to the bigger, longer term picture. Or it may be that someone has gone out, they've done a bit of market research, they've heard lots of people saying, well, I really wish I had a machine that did so-and-so thingy. And they keep hearing this and hearing it, and so they think, oh, I know, I could invent a machine that does that thing, and this is how I'll do it. And off they go to their laboratory or their shed or wherever it is, and tinker away until they come up with the device that does the thing that they've heard lots of other people say they want. Or it may be that some social authority, such as a government is the most obvious example, but there could be a different organisation, decides they want to make a change in society. And they want to make that change even if most other people in society don't want it, but they have decided they want it. And they commission various inventors, scientists, what have you, to go out and devise a machine, a device that does the thing which they, the commissioning elite, want. And having finally invented it, then that device is marketed and released on the public, and the public are encouraged to use it, and perhaps the social change that the government or whoever it is wants is brought about. So in other words, there's different levels at which different inventors may be factoring in the impact of social change that their device will bring, whether they haven't thought about it at all, whether they only invent it because lots of other people say they want change, whether they're inventing it because they themselves as an individual, they want change and it doesn't matter what anybody else wants, or whether it's some, not an individual, but some whole group like a government which wants to bring about change and they're using technology as the means to do it. We could think about devices in that context, and indeed we'll have a chat about that in the virtual classroom. Marshall McLuhan, who was a great thinker back in the 40s and 50s and 60s about the impact of mass media. He was a very influential thinker in America when it came to ideas around the impact of television, for example. So he never lived long enough to see the impact of the mobile phone. This is applying his ideas to something that never existed in his lifetime. But he did make the argument that we can understand technology in these four ways, which is referred to as the tetrad, which just means a set of four. So a form of tech can enhance society. You can look at what does it make greater in society, gets people doing more of in society when they use this piece of technology. What does it reverse? What does it cause to change, to maybe push back? What does it alter in some way? What does it make obsolescent? So are there other forms of technology that people stop using because they've got this new thing to use instead? Or maybe it's not just other forms of technology, maybe it's social practices, behaviours that people stop doing because this new form of technology means they don't have to do it anymore. What, if anything, does it revive? So there may be things that became obsolescent 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, which this piece of tech comes along and brings back. And there's a bit of a nostalgia, a bit of a revival, and it brings something, some behaviour, some idea, some concept back to the fore. So the whoever it was that designed this meme has applied these ideas to the smartphone. So how does the smartphone enhance life? Well, it gives us immediate gratification. You can go online, you use 1,000,001 different apps, you press a few buttons and wallop, it does what you want it to do. You don't have to hang around, you don't have to wait. Some of us are old enough to remember dial-up connections, when computers were first a thing and you'd turn it on and it would make the most horrendous loud noises and you'd have to wait several minutes for it to warm up and start working, during which time you probably went off and made yourself a cup of tea or something. These days, within seconds, in fact, if it's not working within 1 or 2 seconds, people start to get impatient and start banging their phone about. It's instant gratification. whatever you can think of, someone somewhere in the world has probably designed an app for it. So there's this constant, you want it, we'll make it mentality going on. You can have apps to identify constellations in the night sky, apps to identify plants, apps to work out currency changes if you're going abroad, apps for maps when you're driving, maps when you're walking. Anything you can practically imagine, someone somewhere has developed an app for it. It makes you connected to people far away, as well as people close to you, so you can talk to people on the other side of the planet within a matter of seconds. So the whole world is joined up, or at least it feels like that, as a result of this. That sense of connection is not just to your next door neighbours, it's on the grand scale. Does this improve social ties? Well, maybe it does. Is there a bit of a pushback, a bit of a resistance, a bit of an annoyance to the mobile phone? Well, some of us do find mobile phones and smartphones and what have you very, very intrusive and annoying, that there's people calling you at all hours of the day and night and sending you messages and the damn thing going bleep, 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 waking you up if you're daft enough to have it in your bedroom. So people make conscious decisions to turn their phone off because they don't want to be bombarded with distractions, whether for a few hours or a whole day or a month or however long it is that they want to turn off and go away. They may find it an incredible distraction from the other things they're trying to do. They may not want their boss to be able to call them every minute of the day and night, or their mother-in-law or whatever relative it is they're trying to avoid. So rather than being an enhancement for instant connectivity to everyone, it may be seen as more of a barrier in which it makes some people more annoying than otherwise they would have been back before the invention of the smartphone. So that it may cause problems rather than advantages, or rather than as well as the advantages. What's it made obsolescent? Do people own, well, some people do, I know someone who does actually, but the majority of people no longer have a phone that's all it is. It just makes phone calls, it doesn't do anything else. So those kinds of devices, whilst they're still around, they're quite few and far between. Most people, if they're going to have a device, they'll have a smartphone that does 310 different things, of which making phone calls is only one of them. So once upon a time, you would have had to have had a phone, and a camera as a separate device, and a scanner as a separate device, and a laptop as a separate device, and something to play your music on as a separate device. Nowadays you can have one gizmo that does all of those things and about 300 other things as well. So are we moving to a period when there will be fewer and fewer cameras, fewer and fewer devices of one type or another on which to play music, because we'll just have one machine that does practically everything? Possibly. Has it revived any nostalgic old-fashioned things? Well, some people, you can obviously have all sorts of ringtones, but one of the options is for the noise made by an old-fashioned rotary phone from the 70s and 80s. Whether that's favoured mainly by people old enough to remember those machines, or whether it's become a kind of appeal to the very young who can't remember those machines at all, I'm not sure. I don't know what the demographics are there. But you've also got styles of computer game that appeared to have died a death, ping-pong type games that have been brought back as a sort of a nostalgic fad to have them on your smartphone as well. So something that looked as if it had died a death is brought back. We could think about applying the tetrad to other kinds of devices, and when you do your object of modernity presentations, I'd strongly encourage you to come back to this presentation, have a look at McLuhan's tetrad, and see if you can answer these 4 questions in respect to whatever device it is that you're presenting as an object of modernity. So what does it enhance, what does it reverse, what does it make obsolescent, and what does it revive, if anything? Think about it in those contexts. So yes, I'm just repeating myself there, aren't I, on the screen? It may be that you can't necessarily answer all four of those issues for some devices, but at least give it a thought and use that, I would suggest, as a structure for your presentation. So having said what your object of modernity is and a little bit about the history of it, when it was invented, who invented it, and all that kind of stuff, you could then say, right, I'm now going to talk about McLuhan's method, and I'm going to start by talking about what does this object retrieve, and then I'm going to talk about what does it reverse, and that becomes a layout, a way of structuring your short presentation. Two examples. Some of you in the class will know what these things are, and some of you might be looking at them and thinking, what the hell is that? Because you weren't possibly in some cases even born until after these things had become obsolescent. So for the young amongst you who don't know what these things are, that weird contraption in the photo at the top is a Sinclair C5, and the guy with the glasses sitting in it is Mr. Sinclair, Clive Sinclair. He invented that C5, and it was meant to be a way of getting about town. So rather than taking a bus or taking your car or going on a bike, that if you wanted to get from one side of town to the other to make a fairly short journey, you could sit in one of these devices, and they had an engine, so you didn't have to pedal or anything, but you would be able to go across town in one of them and park it up. His argument being that it was much smaller, it didn't use anywhere near as much petrol, so it was cheaper, it was more environmentally friendly and efficient, this, that and the other. Did it catch on? Like hell, did it. It lost him a mountain of money because no one seemed to really want them. Why did very few people want to buy it? Well, therein is a discussion, and that's something we can think about as we go along, not necessarily about the Sinclair C5 itself, but we can think about why some forms of technology don't last more than 5 minutes. Why are some things hugely popular and other things are a flash in the pan, people get really bored with it really quickly and stop using it? The Betamax down there was one of the alternatives to having VHS tapes, and possibly there's some people in the class saying, what on earth is a VHS tape? So before we had DVDs, we had VHS tapes, which were quite chunky, and one of the alternatives was the Betamax, which was like a mini type of tape, half the size of a VHS tape. But for some reason, and again, who knows what, the general public much preferred to buy the chunky VHS tapes than to buy the much smaller Betamax tapes, recording devices. And so not only did the tapes go the way of all flesh, but obviously the machines to play them on also fell out of fashion and stopped being manufactured and stopped being sold. It was a kind of a short-lived phenomenon. They became obsolescent, replaced by other technology, newer technology. Chap in the photograph here is William Ogden. He developed the theory of cultural lag, and he said when technology comes along, there's a bit of a cultural lag. It takes a while for technology to spread, and of course, as in the case of the Sinclair C5, sometimes it just doesn't spread at all. You know, a handful of people buy it, most other people won't buy it, and therefore it just dies. It ceases to be. So the stages, Ogden said, that can be understood in terms of the spread of technology. First off, you have very obviously the invention, the thing, the device, the machine is made. Somebody comes up with it, and obviously they need a bit of financial backing to mass manufacture and spread it out there. But it's spread, and so you move from the invention of the thing to accumulation. As the device is financed, it's made more widely available, people start seeing adverts for it, more and more people start buying it, but also at the same time it may be improved upon, either by the original inventor or by other people. So you might have like the old-fashioned version of it, then as with smartphones, there's the latest version of this and the latest version of that, and it replaces the earlier versions of that device. And so you end up with a bit of a pile of outdated machinery because it's all been replaced by the latest version of the thing. As well as changing versions of the same technology, you also have diffusion, as the idea of using it spreads from one part of the world to another part of the world, but also between cultural groups in the same part of the world. So an obvious example is something that, when it's invented, let's say the very first mobile phone to be invented was very, very expensive. That's usually the way with new technology. It's very, very expensive to start with. And so the only cultural group that can afford it are the very rich, the people with a ton of money who can buy the device. But back to accumulation, new versions are invented, and newer versions are often cheaper than the earlier versions, and so the price drops. And then back to diffusion, it spreads from the very rich cultural group into the not quite as rich middle class group, and then it spreads from there into the possibly quite poor working class group as cheaper and cheaper versions of the same thing are made. There may be movements between other cultural groups. So, for example, a thing might be very, very popular with women and only slowly become more popular with men, or vice versa. It may be really popular with the young and only slowly become popular with the middle-aged and then the elderly, or vice versa. So cultural groups can be understood in various different ways. So not only is it spreading from one country to the next country to the next, but within a country it may be starts in one part of society, one section of society, and gradually winnows its way out to other sections of society. The adjustment phase is when people like me, who are not very technically minded, who kind of just learn the basics and stick to it, and don't feel very adventurous with technology, we gradually adjust how we use tech. So like a lot of people, most people, I have a smartphone. I use it to send emails sometimes, to go on Facebook sometimes, and to make phone calls and send text messages. My smartphone does about 500 other things, but I've no idea what most of the apps do because I've no interest in using them. So they are redundant, they just sit there filling up the memory of my smartphone. So I'm one of those adjustment type people, a non-technical person. I kind of start to take on board technology, but in a very limited way. That's as an individual. Adjustment can also apply to institutions as well as to individual people. So, for example, in a culture, you might say, well, how has the church or whatever religious group taken on board this technology? How has education, how have schools and colleges taken on board this technology? How have the arts taken on board this technology? So there'll be different aspects of a society where it's not one person, it's a large number of people. The question then becomes, are they using this technology or ignoring it or disapproving of it? I mean, they might decide it's very, very inappropriate technology for them to use on some occasions. Part of the cultural lag is this idea that it takes time, and that by the time one section of society is catching up to a form of technology, that form has already become a bit old hat to other more tech-savvy sections of society. Some societies are very, very resistant and loath to use certain forms of technology, so the Amish are a really good example of that, where they like to go around in horse and carriages rather than cars because they really don't like modern technology and they've resisted certain forms of modern technology. The Deobandi, which is a denomination within Islam that's mostly popular in India and Pakistan, ban the uses of the TV. They don't like people having TVs because they regard television as bringing sort of pornography and greed and making alcohol popular and doing all sorts of things that they consider highly inappropriate for devout Muslims to do. So they are very resistant to members of that particular denomination within Islam to use television. Ironically, they do use the internet and computers, which is, if anything, probably worse than television. But again, it's sort of the way groups adapt to some forms of technology but resist other forms of technology is the kind of thing that Ogborn is exploring. That's Where there is resistance, there will be, again, this sense of cultural lag. And part of it is that brand new technologies frequently cause an element of instability in the society. They shake things up. So with cyber technology, you get phenomena that no one quite knows how to deal with for a while, like cyber technology or child pornography online, cyber security, stealing people's identities, hacking into their machines to rob them of their bank details and one thing and another. It takes a while for society to catch up and for law codes to catch up and for notions of socially appropriate behaviour to catch up with the ever-changing technology. Particularly so, obviously, Ogburn has been dead for quite a long time. It's even more so now than it was in Ogburn's lifetime, because the speed of technology is now much, much faster for us than it was for Ogburn back in the 20s. A Luddite, if anyone's unfamiliar with the term, goes back to the Industrial Revolution and a group of people who despised new technology because it was putting them out of work, and they went around trying to smash technology of the day and kind of re-establish their rights. And so a Luddite is someone who really doesn't like a certain form of technology, but is very resistant to it. Sometimes think I'm a bit like that. So I've already given examples, I mentioned child porn just now, as an example of a negative innovation, that not all innovations, inventions, devices, new machinery, new technology, not all of it is good. Sometimes along with the good stuff you get bad stuff coming into society, which could be something like the car brings with it the ability to travel vast distances very quickly, but it also, on the negative side, brings air pollution and noise pollution and the risk of people getting run over and killed. So with the good there is the bad. And again, that's something you might want to think about with your object of maternity presentation. What's the good stuff that's come from this object, but also is there any bad stuff that's come from this object, any negative stuff? So with the internet and so on, you get child porn. With high-tech computer-operated AI devices, you also get things like weaponized drones that can be flown over a battlefield or indeed flown over a city or a town, and they can drop bombs on people. They can drop germ warfare devices on people from a vast, operated by someone sitting in a nice safe office hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away, who never has to see the mess they're creating in flying their devices and dropping weapons on people. They can also be used to assassinate individuals as well as kill large numbers. We have devices that can rob people blind by copying their credit cards without them even knowing they've been copied. Just by walking quite close to them and enabling the device to read their card, it can then charge them for all sorts of things they don't know they're being charged for. So there are devices, inventions created specifically to meet a rather negative need. But there's also the idea of a negative consequence, where the need isn't intended, it just happens. So obviously something like a weaponized drone or a pornography website is a deliberate invention. Someone has gone out of their way to make that. Whereas with the negative consequences, they haven't intended for it to happen, it's just happened. So are we now over-dependent on technology? There are people who practically have withdrawal symptoms and start twitching if the internet crashes and they can't get online for more than 5 minutes. Do we know how to find information when the net's not working? Fewer and fewer people use libraries, fewer and fewer people have collections of books and so on, because they're so reliant on tech to provide all of that for them. Have we seen a collapse of public and private space? When we get on to talking about Jürgen Habermas and his theories, in a few weeks' time we'll explore this in more detail, but the notion that here am I sitting at home talking to a laptop that's recording my voice. So my home life and my work life are enmeshed. Am I in private? Am I in public? So you can probably occasionally hear noises in the background because of who else lives in my house walking up and down and going backwards and forwards, which you would never hear if I was at work. Again, it's that merging of public and private. And is that really where we want to go in the world? Is that a good place to go? Or is it much better to keep a strong barrier between the outside world and our own private homes? So there's all sorts of kind of knock-on issues that come about. Alvin Toffler, even back in the 1970s, let alone in the 2020s, was talking about this idea of future shock, that a lot of people get alarmed and panicked by high-tech inventions and feel left behind. And it's easy to stereotype that as being the elderly, but it doesn't have to only be the elderly, it can be lots of other people as well. That the world changes very, very rapidly with new technologies, and if you can't keep up with it, or you don't even want to keep up with it perhaps, you can feel really left out and forgotten and sort of discarded practically, and have lots of anxieties about what the future world is going to turn into. Will we all end up as cyborgs with technology implanted into our brains to enable us to interface with computers? Is that really where we want to go? What's the future going to hold for us? We don't know till we get there, but there's lots of concerns and anxieties. Toffler argued that part of this is the speed of change. There were probably people in the year 1550 moaning about the speed of change, but obviously with each decade that passes into the 21st century, it's getting quicker and quicker and quicker, and devices are being released at such a speed it's hard even for the young to keep up with it, let alone for the middle-aged or elderly to keep up with it. Technosis is the faddy term for dependence on technology, for people who don't know how to function in their social lives or work lives or whatever without their tech devices, and they start to get panicky and worried and flap about and don't really know what to do with themselves without their technology around them. Is that a burgeoning form of mental illness, perhaps? Something to read about. And does technology cause significant changes? So in France, they have outlawed bosses emailing their staff out of hours, because the French felt that work was starting to intrude into the home life. That when people go home, they should be at home with their families, with their friends, with their loved ones, not being constantly harried by their employer. We haven't done that in this country, and so it's a very common sight. You go on the train in the morning, there are people on their laptops answering work emails, doing this, that and the other, even before they get to work, and they're doing exactly the same on the train home of an evening. So they've left work, but they're still kind of at work, except they're at work electronically. And obviously with the whole COVID spiel and all of this working from home malarkey, it's really blurred the working hours. When can you switch off? When are you allowed to say, look, I have finished, stop harassing me, I want to spend time with my family? All of this can only happen because we have the technology to make it happen. 50 years ago, most of this would not have been possible, but now it is. There is some speculation about the extent to which future shock is more specific to some groups than others. I've already mentioned the issue of age groups, the elderly versus the middle-aged versus the young, as to who is better suited to cope with changes in technology and who feels more anxiety about it. It could also be down to wealth issues and religious issues and various other issues that we might want to speculate about as we go along. Thorsten Veblen is one of the people, and he is a Marxist, but some of the other people who think in this way are not Marxists, so it's both within and without that framework. Sorry about this white box that's appeared, it keeps doing this, and I don't know how to turn it off and stop it, it'll go away in a minute or two. So bear with me. So sticking with Veblen, he's argued that technology radically overhauls the way in which society works, the kind of social conditions. I already mentioned this thing just a second ago about people on trains. So compared to the 1960s, you You started work when you arrived at work, and you finished work when you left off, by and large. Teaching has always been a bit of an exception to that, because you have to do the marking people's homework in your own time. Usually that's always been the case. But for the majority of jobs, there was a noticed start and finish time. Whereas these days, you can be contacted all over the place, wherever you are, by new forms of technology. And so the barrier between when you work and when you stop working is much more blurred today. It does depend on the type of job you do, clearly, but it is much more blurred today than it was in the 1960s. Is this intentional? So Verblin is arguing that the technology drives change, that historical events are caused by a new form of technology. So if you think back to the screen with the 4 boxes on it, is it always the case that the people who invent things fully understand the implications of what they're inventing? There may be all sorts of impacts that they just haven't even thought of themselves, and only become obvious as the technology spreads across society. And we're back to the Ogden's idea of the cultural lag, that as more people get the device, it begins to change the way society works. It begins to change the direction history is taking. And so things alter, they amend, they change. Whether we're thinking technology devices like the internet and phones and computers, or whether we're thinking medical technology or all sorts of other technologies, they can have massive impacts that very few people have guessed about when they were in the process of inventing and devising them. An alternative view comes from Langdon Winner, as per the quote at the bottom of the screen, that Winner's argument is it's not so much the technology itself, but the social system, the economic system around the technology that determines how it's going to be used and the impact it will have on society. So if, as per the French example, you live in a culture that puts huge value on family life, they might look at the technology that intrudes on family life and say, look, we're putting family ahead of tech. We're putting family ahead of business. Yes, you've got this technology, but you can't use it in that way. Another society, like British society, might look at the technology and say, we're going to put business ahead of family. If it intrudes in your family life, well, tough luck, because business is more important. Work is more important. And so they will use the same technology, but in a very different way, in a very different direction. So again, is it the society or is it the technology that drives? Technological determinists think it's pushed by technology, others think it's pushed by society. We're starting to see the phenomena of technology-related illnesses, what's sometimes referred to as cyber disorders. The ICD-11 is a diagnostic manual that's used by psychiatrists. It's the International Classification of Disease, ICD. 11 because it's now in issue number 11. It gets updated every few years. It's started to include the latest version, version number 11, a diagnosis of gaming disorder. That is to say, people who are so hooked on playing computer games, spend so much time playing computer games, they get really twitchy and dysfunctional when they're not allowed to be on their game. And they suffer depression and anxiety and all sorts of things unless they are immersed in their game. Is that an actual psychiatric issue? Well, the ICD-11 says effectively yes, but other people think this is it's not really caused by the game, that the game is an excuse, if you like, and that the underlying problems are being masked by the game, and those problems are extending from somewhere else, and it's just the game is providing them with an opportunity not to deal with the issues that they would otherwise need to deal with. Conversely, you've got researchers like Beard there, as per that quote, saying, well, no, it is actually a real thing. You can become addicted to gaming just the way you can become addicted to alcohol or to gambling or to various other different things. And it's a phenomenon in and of itself, rather than being a mask for other issues. Time will tell which direction psychiatry and psychology take on these issues, as more research is conducted and how more and more people start to understand what's going on with technology. Now, we'll finish up with talking about these presentations and what we need to do. So in the group chat we can start firming this up a bit and have more focus on this. Hopefully some of you, well, I know some of you have already started to form groups, but those of you who haven't need to start doing so, of 4 or 5 people that you can meet up with in the class, either meet up physically or meet up virtually. And between you, choose one of those types of magazines you got there on the screen. Go and either acquire them, whether you buy them or you've got old copies lying around the house, or you can ask a friend or relative to give you their old copies, whatever. Lay hands to some copies, and each one of you cut out some images or some sections of text from those magazines that you find interesting, that you feel are highlighting sociological issues to do with the modern world and the way the modern world is going. And on a large piece of paper, the little shop in Leonardo's building sells big sheets of paper for the art students, so you can get a really big chunk of paper from there, or you can go to a shop in town or wherever you want to go to, or cork pinboard. You could do that. That's fun. Pin your imagery up or glue it up onto the board, and then for the presentation, which is around about 10ish minutes, take it in turn so everyone gets a chance in your group to speak. No one is stood there in deathly silence. Everyone gets a chance to say something, where you indicate an image or a bit of text that you put there and say, well, I've put this up because blah 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 reasons, and you're linking your reasons to sociological theory around modernity and the way the world is today, the way the world is going. So we'll do that in class, COVID permitting, on 20th of October. In the Q&A we can discuss this in more detail, so if you've got anything you're not concerned about, anything you are concerned about, you're not sure about, we can explore there. I've shown you this image before. Obviously this is very large scale. You ought to be doing something much smaller than this, because it's a smaller sheet of paper, not an entire classroom wall that you're using to pin up ideas and thoughts. So, but like this one, there's magazine covers and photographs, bits of text people have cut out of magazines or printed off the internet, wherever they've got them from there. But you're presenting concepts and ideas and linking them into theory. That's the route we need to go down. So next week, back to normal, woo! And we'll start to explore ideas of mass communication and different methods of mass communication and mass education, but primarily also, of course, your presentation of these posters and your analysis of the images and the bits of text you've put up. So most of the class will probably be that, with a little bit of me chucking in stuff around mass communication and so on after you've all finished doing your presentations. But I'll see you in the virtual classroom where we can discuss these ideas in more detail. Take care.